Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We're going to keep this one a little bit shorter than normal. Just been feeling a little bit under the weather recently, but I will try to at least provide a few thoughts here. So Bitcoin is just below $69,000. We talked about this potential path several months ago. If you guys remember, we mentioned that this low right here is likely going to get run at the end of April, early May. We saw that. And then sort of the outcome that we talked about was to basically sort of sweep the low, wick to around the 20-week SMA. Normally when you go there, though, you get a bounce off of it, sort of a recoil back up. And then the question is, where does it go from here? Now, we've seen a very similar pattern not that long ago if you sort of ignore the initial false breakout. So if you go back and you look at what happened back over here, we were technically putting in sort of a high and then a lower high, and then we broke through, right? But if you conveniently ignore this and just say, all right, we had a high, a lower high, and then this was like a false breakout, that ultimately here we had another lower high after sweeping this low, right? What happened is after sweeping this low right here, we swept it at the end of January. We then came back up early February, hovered below this low, below this high, this lower high, for about a week and a half or so. And then we got the labor market data come through in early February, and then following the labor market data, Bitcoin took off again. And it kind of goes back to what we've been saying a long time, that these risk assets generally go up until they have a sufficient reason not to do so. Those three reasons really, geopolitical stuff. Can't predict that. At all. There's the labor market. Obviously, that's really difficult to predict too, but until the labor market shows weakness or another round of inflation or something like that. So far, all those things have been kept at bay. Labor market has remained strong. Inflation, while it seems like it hasn't really been going that well, it's still hovering around that 3 to 4% level. And ultimately, after we got all that data come in early February, Bitcoin took off again. It seems like a very similar pattern, right? A very familiar pattern, in the sense that you have these same lower highs. You then sweep the low, right? You then sweep this low, end of April, early May. You rally back up to the highs, but this rally to get back up to the highs is taking a lot longer. In fact, if we take sort of a date range here from this low to get back up to the high, it took about a week. And not these highs, but just back sort of these lower highs. From here to here, it took about 3 weeks. Okay, so it certainly took quite a bit longer to get back up there. And so then the question now is, well, which way is this going to ultimately break? Is it going to break to the upside? Is it not? We've definitely looked at a lot of different comparisons, and it kind of goes back to potentially whatever the labor market data comes in June. If labor market's still resilient and holding up well, all things considered, then Bitcoin. Last June we saw this move here where we actually put in a new high, right? Last June we swept the prior high, we put in a new high, we hovered at around that level for a while, and we came back down. But regardless, that's obviously one outcome, is if the labor market data comes in okay and Bitcoin just continues on. The other would be obviously that if it doesn't come in okay and there's a bad print or something, then you could see further, sort of further consolidation back down, potentially back down to the bull market support band, in fact. And so that'll ultimately be the question, because we talked about this a lot. If you go back and watch the bull market support band video from, a couple weeks ago, last week and the week before, we talked about this idea of, at some point, regardless of what happens in the short, what happens sort of later on, you're going to get a 2-week rally, right? And it's what comes after that 2-week rally that is the more important thing. Is it, does it lead ultimately to higher prices? And I think we should throw in the 8-week SMA up here for context. Does it ultimately lead to, to higher prices, or is it just another lower high? And we have certainly drawn the comparisons to 2019 before, right? Because you had sort of a 2-week rally here that got you back above that 8-week SMA. The first week got you above it. The second week was an open and close above it. Similar setup is here. There are some differences though, right? I mean, back over here, this lower high occurred after ETH Bitcoin had already broken down, right? ETH Bitcoin on this lower high was all the way, down here. Whereas now it's all the way back up here. If you think about like all Bitcoin pairs, they still haven't actually broken down yet. Which also had already happened at this point in 2019. But there's other things like gold had already broken out, or has already broken out, and it broke out long ago, right? Broke out back in March. Also, something that we've talked about a lot is to keep in mind the blue chip dominance thing. This is something we talked about a lot earlier in the year, but Bitcoin was doing all the heavy lifting, so I've mostly just focused on Bitcoin dominance. But if you look at Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, if you go back to some of the videos earlier in the year, I said that sometime later this year we should see it get a weekly close above 73%. This is what ultimately marked sort of a transitionary period in the cryptoverse back over here in 2019. We still haven't seen it happen yet, right? So it hasn't happened. And there's been a lot of times where a lot of these metrics get really close to breaking through, and then they don't. And then we just kind of kick the can down the road again. You can see just how many times blue chip dominance has run above 73%. It happened in December. It happened a couple of times in February. It happened in April. It happened again last week. So again, there's a lot of false moves where it seems like blue chip dominance, Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance is really breaking out, only for it to be short-lived and for us to just go right back down. Now, all things considered, while all these have just been wicks, you can see that the general direction has in fact been up, right? Higher lows as it trends towards 73%. The other thing that we talked about a lot was Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance. Same idea, right? Where it's theoretically going to break above 61%, a weekly close above 61%, but it hasn't happened yet. I mean, we keep getting really close. I mean, we had 60.89, we had 60.73, but every time we get up there, we just simply get rejected. Now, the counterpoint, just like Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, the counterpoint is that, well, it might be getting rejected, but it's still putting in higher lows, right? It's still trending up. And so just like blue chip dominance, just because it's there, it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to immediately break through, but it's one of those things that at some point, I do think it will happen. And again, it's easy to say that sort of stuff because, or you might say, well, it's easy to say that without any timeline. The problem is like, I think this whole process has taken far longer than really anyone expected. And I mean, I think that, sort of the people who have been bearish on dominance for the last couple of years, I think they've honestly been surprised that it just keeps on going higher. And now you have a situation where ETH dominance is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and Bitcoin dominance has been not doing a lot of great things, right? I mean, it's back down to less than 54%. It's back down, in fact, to the bull market support band, right? It's back down to the prior resistance level, right? The prior resistance level at around 54%. Bitcoin dominance is trying to turn that into support. There's no guarantees, but that's what it's currently trying to do, is it's back at that level. I mean, 53.93%, that's essentially where the 20-week SMA, 21-week EMA are. So certainly we keep an eye on that. Obviously, I know everyone's interested in ETH right now because it's been going up quite a bit. And again, this is one of those things where to me it looked like ETH Bitcoin had broken down. I wasn't really expecting the spot ETF stuff to come through, but it did. At the same time, that's cope. The other way to say it is I was wrong. The more honest way to say it. And I mean, I look back at the last two times that ETH Bitcoin broke down, and you have two examples, right? Unfortunately, you only have two examples when ETH Bitcoin broke down, and that was actually 2016 and 2019. And in those cases, in those years where ETH Bitcoin ultimately broke down, you actually do see ETH USD get a long wick up in June, right? There's a wick there in June, and then a wick here in June. Also note that with the spot ETF approval, I imagine on launch day, if it does follow whatever Bitcoin USD did, I mean, Bitcoin had a long wick in June. Maybe ETH USD will ultimately do the same thing. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that it can't come back down first. If you actually look at 2016 closely, what you'll see is that ETH sort of ran back up, and then the following week it sold off, and then it was the 3 weeks after that it went up again. And if you look at 2019, it sold off, ran back up, and then just immediately went into sort of that final push. And again, those were just the last two times that ETH Bitcoin broke down. 2016 and 2019. That's why I compare it to them, right? It has nothing to do with whether it's the halving year or the pre-halving year or anything. It's just all I want to know is the last two times that ETH Bitcoin broke down, and it's 2016 and 2019, and that's why I compare what's going on now in 2024 to this year and this year right here, 2016 and 2019, because those are the years where ETH Bitcoin broke down. So I would still keep an eye on that as it relates to ETH USD and see if it follows a similar pattern or not. But in the short term, Bitcoin is still struggling here. And I think struggling in the sense that it hasn't broken out above this level. And I'm not saying it can't. It's just it hasn't done so yet. We saw Nvidia break above it, right? I mean, so it's not like it's impossible. I mean, Nvidia was able to ultimately break out of these lower highs. But if Bitcoin is unable to break up and it goes back down, then you kind of have this scenario where you look back and you say, well, what happened the last time that Bitcoin USD got rejected off the range high, and we actually saw that Bitcoin dominance went up, right? If you look at the last time right here that it got rejected off the range high, we saw Bitcoin dominance spike up. It hasn't been really rejected. I mean, it's still hanging out here at the highs. So you have a situation where, well, if it gets rejected, maybe Bitcoin dominance goes up. Or if it breaks through, what happened last time Bitcoin broke through and put in higher highs, right? We saw Bitcoin dominance break up. So you have two scenarios, right, where Bitcoin dominance both broke up. The main counterpoint, though, is obviously ETH has sort of stolen the show to some degree. But one way to also think about that is if you look at something like Bitcoin market cap divided by total market cap minus ETH. So now you're sort of taking ETH out of the equation. And when you take ETH out of the equation, you can see that altcoins Bitcoin dominance is still not nearly as far down, right? So the main move down by Bitcoin dominance has essentially just been on the back of ETH Bitcoin, right? Because alt Bitcoin pairs still haven't really moved a lot. And you can actually see that by looking at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. So that's where we are right now. I mean, Bitcoin's still at 68, 69K, still technically a lower high. And I imagine you could still, you could easily see some further consolidation for at least a few more days or maybe into early June before we get some type of ultimate decision. Perhaps the market's waiting for labor market data to come in before it decides. But we will, of course, follow it up. Again, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe if you guys like the content, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.